For 3 months, my son called every night at 9:15 and asked the same question. Are you alone? He never said why. He never asked anything else. It started as an odd habit, fingertip contact between two people who'd once lived under the same roof, and it ended up being the hinge on which nearly everything in my life turned. Last night I lied. I said I wasn't alone. That lie, between me and a voice on the phone, bought me the time I didn't know I needed. It set off a chain of choices that pulled back a curtain I wish I'd never seen, and it kept me breathing long enough to start figuring out what to do next. If this matters to you, if you're the kind of person who watches these stories and wants to learn from someone else's mistakes, please like and subscribe. It helps me tell the rest of this. I live in the house I grew up in, a modest split level just outside Cleveland, a place with the same floorboards and the same backyard swing I remember from childhood. My mother passed years ago. The house felt emptier after that. So when David was small, I did what a lot of single parents do. I did my best and tried to be both anchor and map. David was quiet as a kid, the kind who preferred books to baseball, the kind who would sit on the porch steps, tracing the grain in the wood without saying much. He was smart. He studied numbers the way other boys studied engines. He went into insurance like it suited his temperament, predictable, orderly, rules you could follow. He married once to Jessica. It didn't last. They split after 2 years. It hurt him. It hurt me. He kept working. He kept a low voice. He called me on Sundays. He called to ask about the lawnmower. Small things. Ordinary things. That's why when the calls started, every night at 9:15, I didn't leap to the worst conclusion. I told myself it was a sleeping habit, a way to check in. I told myself he just needed to hear my voice. That was easier. But if I learned anything in the months after the first 9:15, it's that small things can narrow until they become a tunnel with only one point of light. The phone, the voice, the same question. The calls started the night he was let go from the agency where he'd worked, Bruce Patterson's old firm. There were emails about performance, pressure about numbers, and then finally, he texted me one afternoon. They said it's not working out. That evening, the call came earlier than usual. 9:15 rolled around like it always did, and his voice was careful. Are you alone? I told him yes. He seemed relieved. We chatted about nothing in particular. I went to bed with the TV low and the lamps off. The house felt safe. The next day he called again at 9:15, and the night after that. Routine is a dangerous kind of comfort. Routine made me slow to notice the little shifts, tools missing from the garage, a wrench I kept under the sink not where I'd left it, papers on the kitchen table rearranged like someone had been looking for something they couldn't name. I told myself 100 explanations. Old age, my own forgetfulness, a neighbor doing yard work, small thefts, I thought at first. Never did I imagine what was actually happening. One night, a week after the calls began, I told him I wasn't alone. I don't remember what made me lie. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe, in the soft panic that sometimes wakes you up at 3 a.m., I didn't want to admit I went to bed believing he could come in and that I would have no way to stop him. He didn't come that night. I slept. Maybe for the first time in weeks. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that the calls weren't only about checking in. They had pattern, intention. The question itself, are you alone, wasn't a casual check. It was a probe. Did someone else live here? Was there a witness? If he was calling to make sure no one else was there, then there was a reason why he needed to know. I bought a camera. I had resisted the idea at first. These are your grown children, you tell yourself. You don't install cameras in your own home to watch the son who speaks in a quiet voice and makes you coffee sometimes. But fear sharpens logic. The camera was a small box, something Brooke at the hardware store said he'd set up with me while I mumbled at the price. I put it where I could see the back door and part of the living room. It wasn't hidden, not in the way criminals hide things. Visibility, I thought, would discourage anything. A week later, I added another one, aimed at the hallway. The footage came back as a series of timestamps and little rectangles that filled my phone screen. At first, it was the mundane stuff. The cat jumping up on the counter, the bird outside the kitchen window, me getting up to make coffee. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday at 2:37 a.m., a rectangle lit up with a motion alert. I watched him walk across my backyard, a figure swallowed by the night, a glint of something in his hand. He had a key. Everything else, missing wrenches, moved papers, snapped into focus as evidence of a plan I hadn't been able to admit was real. The camera showed him at the back door, the latch sliding with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this more than once. He stepped in, quietly, like a person who didn't want to wake the house. He stood over my sleeping body for a long time. He did not touch me. He photographed a stack of papers on my kitchen island, like a man collecting proof. He moved slowly through rooms, lifting things into his hands, opening drawers. He didn't rush. He had the time of someone who believed he had permission. I sat on the couch and watched the footage again and again. I felt my heartbeat moving in my throat. There are moments in life where memory becomes a second thing. The footage became a mirror showing me things I had never noticed, an extra key by the sink, a photo of the two of us in a frame he'd taken down and held like he was checking for bones. He left with a small box under his arm and a slow, measured step through the yard. He closed the back gate with the same care he used to when we would make secrecy of a late-night fishing trip. He didn't look at the camera. I called Amanda. Amanda Vance has been my friend since my kids were in grade school. She's a lawyer now, practical and exact the way only someone who has built a career on noticing details can be. When she arrived, she wore her coat short and looked at the footage without speaking for a long minute, like a judge reading a case file for the first time. Her mouth went thin. "We need to be careful," she said. "We need to document and we need to secure everything. But we have to call the police. We didn't call Captain Reed that night. I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, but because fear had a gravity that pinched my chest and made me slow. I wanted to collect myself first, to be useful and not hysterical." Amanda pressed me with her look. "You don't get to decide alone who to call anymore," she said softly. "You have to tell someone who can do something." We woke David's apartment to see what else might explain the footage. This meant driving across town to the place he was renting, a small unit over an old bakery, the kind of apartment building where the pipes rattle at night. We stood in his kitchen and looked. Debts were there, email notices, final notices, a small ledger of amounts owed. There was a forged-looking sheet of paper folded under a book by his bedside, the name of the bank and my own name typed in a tidy professional font with a few signatures that didn't read like his handwriting. There were receipts in neat piles. There was a clean sealed vial tucked in a Ziploc bag with a small note that said, in handwriting that looked more like a careful script than a scrawl, "For sedation, follow with 2cc of X." There was also in a drawer a power of attorney form with my name on it and a firm stamp. Wrongly executed, Amanda said, and probably forged. We didn't know what the vial contained. Amanda suggested a forensic analysis and told me not to handle anything else. I felt like a fool for touching the box on the footage, for the copies I'd made. Amanda packed it in a plastic bag and put it in her coat like she was stashing evidence. I sat on David's couch and thought about how often you imagine the possibilities and how rarely you imagine yourself being right. He wasn't the kind of person to leave a vial of anything marked in such a way unless he had a purpose. The receipts suggested careful purchase. The ledger suggested desperation. The forged form suggested cold calculation. My hands shook. We called Captain Marcus Reed the next day. He wears his authority quietly. He is not a man who thrives on melodrama. He listened and asked a few pointed questions. Had I seen the vial? Did I want to press charges? Did I have immediate fear for my safety? Amanda answered for me when I couldn't. Captain Reed asked that we leave everything as it was and not confront David. He said they would open a file and have a detective look at the footage. We need probable cause to act, he told us, professional and flat. We also need to avoid tipping anyone off. If there's a plan, we don't want to endanger anyone by moving too fast. Theo Alvarez came in on the recommendation of a friend of Amanda's who knew someone in the lab. Theo is a forensic chemist, thin, dark, with a pair of glasses that made him look more curious than anything. He took the vial and handled it like an archaeologist would hold a fossil. Preliminary, he said when he finished the first round of tests. But this is not something you want in your system. There's a synthetic opioid component, and a short-acting barbiturate in there too. Together in the proportions here, it could depress breathing. Dangerous. Very dangerous. Hearing that made the room tilt. I've seen drug paraphernalia in my life in the news and in neighborhoods, always with the headlines and the spectacle. This was quieter. This was clinical. The words synthetic opioid and barbiturate together sounded like a sentence. Amanda frowned. We need to chain this evidence and get it to the detectives, she said. We need to make sure this is catalogued. At home, the kitchen table had become a landscape of proof, photos from the camera, a screenshot of the timestamp, Amanda's notes, my telephone records. There was also a life insurance packet tucked under an envelope that had my name on it and a policy number. I hadn't been to the bank in months. I hadn't been listed as a beneficiary on anything. Yet in the folder was a policy in my name, with a beneficiary listed as Estate of David Stafford, and a face value of $1.5 million. There was a clause, Amanda pointed out, that doubled the payout in cases of accidental death. That was the line that tightened my chest. I put the file down and closed my eyes. Everything in me wanted to call him, to say his name and ask what the hell this was. The sensible part of me, the part that remembered phone trees and advice columns, told me not to. Amanda was careful. You should not contact him, she said. If he is planning something, you could put yourself in immediate danger. We need to coordinate with Captain Reed. If there is a pattern, the police will want to know every example. We've got the footage now. We have the vial. We have the forged document. That establishes a trail. Helen is my neighbor. She's lived 2 houses down for nearly 20 years. She's small and quick and has a way of appearing in moments you need someone to hold the flashlight. I told her about the camera and the footage because I needed someone not in the official job to be present, someone to sit with me when the nights got long. Helen listened with the kind of attention that's skillful at practical tasks. I'll keep an eye on things, she said. I'll have my phone on. She also, without me asking, checked my stove one morning when Amanda and I were still at David's apartment. The stove is old and sometimes the knob sticks. Helen had gone in to start a pot of coffee and called me on the back porch, voice small but urgent. Mike, there's a device under the burner. I tell this part carefully because the image conjures 1,000 possibilities and the law requires me to be precise. Helen's description was restrained. She called it a timed object, a small mechanical thing with a little clock face and a wire. She didn't describe how to do it. She told me she'd called Amanda right away and then disconnected it carefully and locked it in a metal box Helen keeps for her tools. Amanda arrived and photographed it, protocol, and then handed it off to Captain Reed's detective with instructions not to discuss it publicly. The device was moved into police custody the same afternoon. I have not and will not attempt to recreate its mechanism. I will say only that the device's presence on my stove made everything real in a way the footage alone could not. When the police took the device and the vial, when the detective photographed the life insurance paperwork and compared signatures, my house felt like a crime scene I couldn't leave. My coffee cooled. The house exhaled at a frequency I hadn't noticed before. The refrigerator's hum, the tick of a wall clock at 9:15, the small click of the 2 panes of glass when the wind pushed at the windows. That clock, 9:15, became a drumbeat. It marked a pattern I couldn't ignore. The calls had started at 9:15 and the footage had shown entry at 2:37 a.m. There were numbers that didn't add up, like a math problem with the final equation missing. I printed more screenshots and spread them across the table. I wrote down dates and times. Amanda wrote in her precise hand. Helen sat on the floor like a teacher's assistant with the phone on her knee, making sure Captain Reed could call if he needed to. We had the evidence, and yet we were answering more questions than we had answers. David's relationship with money had been tight for a long time. In his ledger were notes about loans and a line reminding him of deadlines. Bruce Patterson, his former boss, had said to Amanda in a phone call she later told me about that David had been under pressure at the office. He was missing quotas. He was anxious. But I never thought he'd cross a line. Amanda told me Bruce's reaction wasn't definitive. Employers often speak to protect their liability. Still, Bruce's voice-reading documentary in my head made the facts align in an ugly way. Motive, opportunity, access. One night, a few days after Amanda and I had been to his apartment, I put the camera footage on for no reason other than a need to watch the person I had once known as a boy move like a stranger in my house. The scene where he stood over my sleeping form burned into me. There were pauses where he seemed lost, where his hands trembled as he fumbled with papers. There were gestures that didn't look like malice so much as sorrow. A man collecting what he thought would fix something. When he left with the small box under his arm, he did it silently. He closed the door without slamming it. He walked away with a slump I associated with the weight you get from carrying bills and bad news. I will say this plainly. I never saw David as a violent man. Even in the footage, he didn't seem like a person who wanted to hurt me personally. I am careful here because the way the world writes about mental illness can be cruel. It paints with a broad brush that flattens people into headlines. The footage told me he had a plan. The vial and the forged power of attorney told me that plan was methodical. The life insurance told me possible motive. The device on the stove told me the plan had technical components I did not understand. None of this absolved him of responsibility, and none of it made me feel like the son I'd raised was wholly lost. Only that something in him had become both dangerous and needy in ways I didn't know how to mend. When Amanda suggested we prepare for the next call, because of course the calls continued, I felt something like a net drop into my stomach. "We'll have you at home at 9:15, she said. "If he calls, we'll be recorded. We'll have Helen. We'll have Captain Reed on standby." She meant practical things. I heard the plan as a vow. It felt like a trap and a lifeline at the same time. The day before the night I'd lied again. I went through my old photos. There is one of David on the porch swing when he was 7, hair in the wind, eyes squinting like he was trying to look beyond the horizon. There is a letter he wrote in the back of a high school notebook promising to take care of me when I retired. Those pages didn't answer the questions on my table. They did one other thing. They reminded me that the line between a child and an adult person who does harm is brittle. People slip across it in ways that are not always readable until it's too late. We set up more formal measures that night. Amanda brought a small voice recorder. Helen agreed to sit in the den with the lights on, a human presence. Captain Reed said he'd have a uniform in the area and a detective watching the feed. I told myself to sleep. In the end, I barely did. The house was a collection of sounds. The boiler, the old pipes, the clock in the hallway that ticked toward 9:15 like a metronome. At 9:12, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Captain Reed. "We're in the area. Call us if anything changes." I felt then the full strangeness of living in the present while the past assembled its evidence. At 9:14, I could hear Helen in the next room, the soft rattle of a crossword page. My hands fumbled with the kettle, making tea I didn't want. The phone rang at 9:15 and my chest opened and closed like someone who had been stopped suddenly underwater. "Are you alone?" David asked. I looked at Helen. She nodded. I set the recorder to vibrate in my jacket pocket. I looked at the clock. I lied. I said I wasn't alone. His voice on the other end was small. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I won't bother you tonight." He hung up. I remember the sound like it was a door closing on the edge of a dream. Relief washed me in a way that was almost stupidly simple. I was still breathing. But the relief was brittle. I couldn't explain to myself the reason that answered made him go away. I could only say that the lie bought me another night. 2 nights later, the footage showed him at 2:37 a.m., standing in my kitchen with a quiet camera flash and taking a picture of a paper with my name on it. It was then that the plan I had feared turned into an architecture of evidence. Amanda told me later that everyone wants closure quickly. The police asked me to be patient. Captain Reed said they had leads, but detectives don't like to announce their moves. We were being careful, and only sometimes felt like the people who had a right to feel safe. I am telling you this, not to credit myself with any bravery. I told that lie because fear sharpened my instincts. I told it because I needed time. That time let me assemble a truth far larger than any single night. The lie didn't solve the problem. It made it noticeable. It forced us to collect proof. It kept me alive long enough to call Amanda and to have Captain Reed's men waiting not to ambush, but to intervene. There are nights I replay the footage where David stands in the kitchen and looks at a framed photograph of us together, the edge of his thumb brushing the glass like he's reading a sentence only he can see. I imagine what voices he'd been hearing if he heard any. I imagine him telling himself a story that convinced him what he was doing was necessary. Those imaginings are dramatized. Reconstructions my mind builds when it tries to fill gaps the way a building fills missing bricks. I will mark them here. Dramatized thought. He might have said to himself, in a voice not recorded, "This is for both of us. He doesn't need to know. He'll be easier if he goes first." That language is a creation of my mind, a way to understand emotion I couldn't measure. It is not taken from any recorded confession. Amanda and I went through David's apartment carefully that afternoon, cataloguing what looked like evidence and what might have been the symptoms of someone in crisis. We found letters from creditors and a notebook where he had, in small decimal points, listed amounts due. We found a printed copy of a power of attorney with my name and an address that matched my house. We found the vial in a baggie with typed instructions. We found a passport-sized photograph of my son and his ex-wife with a stamp on the back I didn't recognize. We found a list, neat bullet points that suggested planning, earlier than I'd thought, earlier than I wanted to accept. Theo came back to the house to take a swab of fingerprints and to sample the soil on the back doormat. He said small things, clinical, methodical things that were frightening because they placed the scenario into a language I couldn't unhear. "Premeditation shows patterns," he said, waving a small brush. "That's not a question of intent. You either have signs of preparation or you don't. These items indicate preparation." He handled the objects like a man pained by them, like a dentist dealing with a cracked tooth in a patient he doesn't know but can't help. The police told us they would act with caution, that arrests made without the proper paper trail can collapse an investigation. Captain Reed asked me to keep quiet, to not post anything on social media. He said, simply, "We don't want to make this worse by acting like a theater production." His practicality was a comfort and a distance all at once. He told us he would arrange for an officer to be physically nearby on the next nights, and that if necessary they'd try an approach that minimized risk to everyone. He didn't promise a result. He told me only that he would try. That night I lay on my side and listened as the house breathed. The phone on the table glowed 99905 9 to 10. I thought about the small hinge of the lie, how a single sentence can be both a falsehood and salvation. I thought about my son, the small boy on the porch swing, the young man who'd called me 30 times and asked a single impossible question. I thought about what it takes to stand in front of someone you love who is doing harm and decide whether to call the police or call a doctor or call a friend and beg for help. We were assembling the truth like puzzle pieces on my kitchen table, and every piece came with a cost. The footage, the forged documents, the vial, the device, the life insurance. They each had weight. They didn't answer why my son was doing what he did. That came later, in conversations with Dr. Mercer and in hospital corridors where professional words would try to make sense of a mind's internal weather. For now, we had only the facts and the choice of what to do with them. We decided to be there the next night, again, at 9:15. Amanda would be at my side, Helen would be in the den, Captain Reed would have a cruiser parked a block away. I told myself it was enough. I told myself that preparation was action. I told myself that a lie could be a shield long enough to bring reinforcements. When the phone rang at 9:15 again, I felt the old animal surge, muscles taut, senses sharp. The voice on the line was quieter now, weary, and yet there was still a thread of decision in it. I put the phone on speaker so Amanda and Helen could hear if they needed to. I lied. No, I said, I'm not alone. On the other end, a sound like a breath left him. Okay, he said. I'll come by in the morning. He hung up. For a few minutes, the quiet over the house felt enormous, like an ocean. The lie had kept him from the door that night. It had given us a margin to act. It had, in its smallness, allowed a much larger truth to surface. That larger truth would demand answers I didn't have. It would involve police interviews and forensic reports, and a medical path none of us wanted to imagine. It would ask me, as a father, whether to seek punishment or help for a son who had made choices and who also might be very ill. Those decisions were not simple, and they were not mine alone. For now, the cameras sat in their little nests, watching a house I had thought I knew. The clock kept its time. The 9:15 calls continued, like a metronome keeping a score we had yet to finish. The footage had shown entry at 2:37 a.m. once. It was an image I could not unsee, my son moving through the rooms of the house that raised him, touching evidence of a life he'd helped build and taking small pieces away. We had proof. We had motives, or at least things that looked like motives. We had the vial, the forged documents, the insurance policy. And we had, most painfully, a human being, my son, at the center of a plan whose edges cut deep. The next day, with the police more formally involved and a detective assigned, Amanda and I stepped back to make sure every detail was accounted for. We photographed, we logged, we wrote down what the footage showed. Captain Reed said the first formal interviews would be with me and then with neighbors. He asked me to tell everything. I did. I have spent the days since doing what people do after any shock. Calling old friends, looking at photographs, trying to make sense of the person whose face is in those pictures. I think often about forgiveness and about the limits of it. I think about responsibility and about the habits parents pass unintentionally. I don't have any moral absolutes to offer. I only have the sequence of events and the knowledge that a single small falsehood, I'm not alone, had kept the next step from happening that night. The truth behind that lie isn't simple. It wasn't a moral failing only. It wasn't heroism only. It was a choice made under fear to give time to others who could take action. That time let us collect evidence. That evidence let us ask professionals to intervene. In the next hours we would find more. A forged power of attorney executed with care, bank transfers, a ledger that looked like someone cataloging outcomes. Theo's preliminary report on the vial was stark in its implication. Captain Reed's detective said the device on the stove could have been deadly in the circumstances. Amanda said the insurance policy complicated everything with the scent of motive, and that would become crucial in any legal proceedings. I am telling this now and pausing here because the sequence is what matters. You can see the arc forming, pattern, discovery, escalation. I'm sitting at the kitchen table again as I write, the clock over the stove ticking toward another 9:15, and I keep thinking about small acts, how a lie can be a shield, and how a recorded silence on a phone can sound like a judge's gavel. We had more questions than answers, and that is where this first part of the story must end. With us standing at the stove, photos spread across the table, a camera rolling quietly in the corner, and the knowledge that the next phone call could be ordinary, or it could be the moment when everything changed. I had lied, and that lie gave me time. The truth behind the lie, the forged documents, the vial, the device, the policy, was only beginning to reveal itself. The detective arrived with a folder and a calmness that felt like weather settling before a storm. He introduced himself, Detective Hargrove, and asked me to walk him through everything again. The footage, the vial, the forged power of attorney, the life insurance packet. He asked about the nights. He wanted precise times. I gave them. He took notes without expression, his pen scratching a line like a metronome. They did what police do when they need to make a case without tipping an alarm. They catalogued evidence, they photographed the kitchen and the back door, they bagged the little items Amanda had placed into plastic. Captain Marcus Reed stopped by after the detective had left and stood at my kitchen island looking at the photographs spread like a map of a life. "We won't rush," he said, "but we'll be ready." Ready meant presence. It meant a cruiser parked a block away for the nights to come, and it meant a detective assigned to watch the feed live if we called. It meant that for the first time since the footage, I felt watched by people whose job it was to care for things like this. That, oddly, made me breathe more evenly. Days blurred into a kind of waiting that has its own weight. I went to the police station to give a formal statement. Amanda sat beside me in the interview room and tapped her pen on the paper when the questions came. She kept her voice low and steady when she repeated facts, the way a surgeon repeats steps in a complicated operation. "He had motive," she said plainly in one moment, as though naming the parts of a picture helps. "He had opportunity. But we also have to consider state of mind. We need the lab results and the psychiatric evaluation." Her caution, both legal and humane, became a frame for everything that followed. We were not only pursuing an answer to what happened, we were trying to ensure whatever answer we had would protect everyone. Theo called with his preliminary lab notes and a voice that was careful. "It's the kind of combination that could put someone into respiratory depression," he said. "Not necessarily instantaneous in small doses, but combined the way they are here. And if administered with another depressant, or in a compromised situation, yes, it could be lethal. We need to run confirmation tests. Chain of custody is intact. We can trace purchases. There are receipts that match some of the compounds." He was a scientist to his bones. He did not speak in fear or in sensationalism. He spoke in margins and probabilities. His language rooted the fear in data. A week after the cameras first showed David at the back door, an officer knocked at my front door while the light outside was still soft with afternoon. It was the kind of knock that felt like an invitation to a serious meeting. Captain Reed and a detective stood there with a folder that had a title on it I couldn't read without a tug in my chest. "We need to serve a warrant," Reed said, "and we need to talk to him. We'll try to do it without incident. But Mike—" He paused, as if choosing a word that was both in his job description and beyond it. "He won't be alone." They left to coordinate. Amanda and I drove to the address where David had been living. We didn't go to confront him. The officers, Detective Hargrove and 2 others, had the scene arranged. They knocked at his door, which opened after a moment to reveal him standing like someone waiting to be expected. He wore his coat like a shell. That shell was thin. I did not recognize the person immediately. He looked smaller, and there was an unfocused way his eyes would move like someone scanning the room for something I could not see. He stepped outside and let the detective say what needed saying. They had probable cause to search. David heard it all, but he did not react the way people do when they are accused. He listened to the words as if they were the weather. Something that could be reported in facts, but not something that would alter his inner condition. They took him to the station for questioning. I stayed in my car in the parking lot because Amanda talked me through the legalities with a voice that did not leave room for what-ifs. Bruce Patterson came to the station later, asked to see me in a quiet corridor, and told me of the pressure at work, of missed quotas, and of a nervousness that Bruce described as different from the sorts of stress his staff usually showed. He didn't judge when he spoke. He seemed to be reporting a pattern that had concerned him and, like me, had leached into a worry that now looked more like evidence. At the station, detectives showed me the items taken from David's apartment. The vial in a sealed envelope, the printed receipts of purchases, the ledger marked with amounts and dates, and the forged power of attorney form. They let me handle none of it. Amanda watched with a face that balanced friendship and counsel. She told me later that the forensic lab had run a background check and found that payments for certain precursor chemicals had been made on a card that could be traced through an account David had access to. The details were technical and grinding, but they built a picture: purchases, fabrication of papers, entry into the house, and the device on the stove Helen had found. The arraignment came sooner than I'd expected. I sat in the gallery of the courthouse and watched through the lens of a man whose heart kept time to a clock he couldn't see. The prosecutor read a short list of charges: attempted homicide, forging documents, possession of dangerous substances among them. The words landed like stones. David stood with a lawyer appointed to him. He did not look at me. He stared at the bench with a stillness I couldn't parse. His lawyer said little. He said what needed to be said to move the case along, that his client pleaded not guilty. The judge set bail and dates. David remained in custody. What followed was a complex legal choreography. The prosecutor's office gathered their exhibits. Amanda helped me prepare. She told me to expect statements, cross-examinations, and an examination of mental state. They will have to consider whether he knew what he was doing, she told me. That matters to the charges and to what kind of trial will happen. I went to see him once, in a small visiting room where voices don't travel for comfort. It was an arrangement of glass and plastic chairs, the kind of environment designed to make human contact functional and tidy. He sat across from me, and for a long time we both watched each other like strangers. I tried to say his name, and he turned it over in his mouth, as if checking the texture of it. "Dad," he started, and I felt the gravity of that single syllable. He spoke in a voice that had the cadence of someone exhausted. He looked tired in a way hunger doesn't explain. When I asked him why, he didn't say for money, in the way the prosecutor later claimed to assemble. He said something I'd hear again in fragments. They told me to. He told me it's for both of us. He spoke as if recounting pieces of instruction from another voice. He mentioned the calls we had shared and a logic I couldn't follow. I asked him about the device and the vial. He looked at his hands, and for a moment he seemed very young. "I thought he'd accept it," he said. "I thought he'd—" He cut off. He couldn't finish in that room without my eyes turning into instruments of guilt. Not everything he said in that visit was a confession. It was more like a map of his disorientation. I later learned that what he had begun to describe were auditory hallucinations, voices instructing him, compelling him in ways that made internal sense to him, even if they had no purchase on outside reality. When I heard that, I resisted the urge to turn immediate outrage into immediate solution. That resistance is where the empathy, however painful, lived. I kept asking the same question to myself. How much did he know, and how much was he knowing in a mind that was not anchored to the world the rest of us occupy? The forensic chemist, Theodore Theo Alvarez, testified at the preliminary hearing. He brought the lab language into the courtroom in careful lines. The sample contains a synthetic opioid component and a barbiturate, he told the judge. In combination, they are capable of depressing central nervous system function, and in certain dosages and contexts, can lead to respiratory failure. He did not say murder or attempted murder. He described capacity and risk. His testimony was critical because it established that what had been in that vial could have killed a person under certain conditions. When he spoke of the device, he was similarly exact and circumspect, an object capable of releasing a harmful agent under timer activation. He left out mechanical specifics. He described only what an objective scientist could document. In court, Bruce Patterson read an email chain aloud about office stress and missed targets. It did not sound like motive in a vacuum, but in the way the prosecutor assembled it, motive became a line item. He stood to benefit financially, the prosecutor said, pointing to the life insurance policy we had found. The policy, nominally listing estate of David Stafford as beneficiary with a face value of $1.5 million and a clause that doubled payouts in accidental deaths, became one of the key anchors of the state's argument. Amanda pushed back in voir dire with careful objections. She argued that motive did not equate to capability or sanity. Then came the medical testimony, that part of the case that moves out of the decisiveness of fingerprints and into the softer, more contested ground of minds. Dr. Robert Mercer was called as a psychiatric expert. He was measured and did not speak in dramatic terms. He reviewed hospital notes, interviews, and preliminary assessments. In court, he was careful to label everything as preliminary and suggestive. He said words that felt like both relief and new weight. My preliminary psychiatric evaluation suggests the presence of a psychotic episode with features that could be consistent with a diagnosis on the schizophrenia spectrum, including auditory hallucinations and disorganized thinking. These observations are preliminary and require further longitudinal assessment. At the time of the alleged conduct, the defendant likely experienced severely impaired judgment due to psychosis. Those phrases, preliminary, suggestive, likely, are what keep courts honest. They remind you that mind is not a ledger. They also shape outcomes. The judge listened. The family in the gallery listened. I listened with a recoil of both sorrow and a faint clarifying hope that if this was as much about illness as about intent, then the pathway after court might lead to treatment rather than to a solely punitive trajectory. The prosecutor argued for the state. The defense argued that because David's mental state rendered him unable to distinguish right from wrong or to act within the norms of law, the appropriate disposition was to evaluate for treatment. It was a collision of two social logics, accountability and care. The judge had to balance both. When the decision came, it landed like a verdict and a medical referral tangled together. The judge ruled that, based on the evidence and the testimony, including Dr. Mercer's preliminary opinion, the defendant was not guilty by reason of insanity. The judge's words were precise. He ordered commitment to a secure psychiatric facility for treatment and evaluation, with periodic judicial review to assess recovery and public safety. He added conditions about supervised care and that the hospital would report progress to the court. It was not a dismissal of what had happened. It was a legal finding that at the time of the acts, the defendant's mental state met the standard set by law for a not guilty by reason of insanity disposition. Saying the words in my head is one thing. Hearing them in a courtroom with the weight of a judge's gavel behind them is another. I felt both the relief that charges would not translate into a long prison sentence without treatment, and a new gravity. My son would be held in a medical setting. He would be treated. He would not be punished in the classical sense, but neither did that mean the consequences were light. He would be committed for a period not to be measured by months alone, but by clinical milestones and judicial review. There are days I replay the scene where the judge reads his decision. I remember how quiet the room felt, like everyone exhaled at once, but no one knew if the air was safe. Amanda squeezed my hand at the end. "You did the right thing," she said. "He'll get the treatment he needs." This is not a free pass. This is a medical response tied to legal oversight. She was steadfast in a way that made the decision feel like a hinge, moving from fear to action. After the hearing, I made a choice that I remember as a very fragile human thing. I could have demanded trial, or I could have pushed for maximum criminal penalties. The prosecutor asked for my input. I told them I wanted treatment for my son. I told them, quietly and without moralizing, that my priority was to see him get care that might help him rediscover a life. That choice was not simple or saintly. It was a decision made in the cross-current of love, guilt, and the unshakable knowledge that whatever harm had been intended, the person at the center of it was my child, and not an abstraction. It was a decision I revisited often in the months that followed, when news articles started to whisper, and when neighbors asked awkward questions. David entered the hospital facility with the same odd combination of resignation and confusion I had seen before. The first weeks were procedural: intake forms, evaluations, stabilization of medication, tests, and interviews. Dr. Mercer, who had testified, became one of the leading voices in coordinating care. He remained careful in what he promised. "We're aiming for stabilization and symptom reduction," he told me on our first meeting in his narrow office with a window that faced a courtyard. "I cannot promise anything, Mike, but we can attempt to manage the psychosis with medication, therapy, and a structured environment." That qualifying language, "cannot promise," was both a comfort and a restraint. We had to live inside it. Visiting arrangements were bureaucratic at first, and then, slowly, more human. The hospital permitted short weekly visits under supervision. At first, our time was halting. Visits took place in rooms with comfortable chairs and soft lighting, the kinds of spaces deliberately chosen so conversation can begin without harshness. David would arrive and sometimes sit for long minutes without speaking. Other times he would talk, and what he said would be fragmented and sometimes shaped by the hallucinations he described. He told me in shards about commands he had heard. He spoke of someone who told him things in the middle of the night, an entity that had phrased action as a necessity. When he spoke like that, I didn't hear excuses. I heard a mind primed to believe the words it heard. It did not render him less culpable objectively. It made the clinical picture clearer. Visits turned into rituals. I would bring him a sandwich he liked from a small deli near the hospital, and a folded photograph of the two of us at the lake when he was 6, grinning with sunburnt shoulders. I learned to watch for small signals that counted as progress. Steady eye contact for a few more seconds than the week before, a joke made that landed, a memory that we could hold together. A day he remembered an event from the week prior, without prompting. Those felt like huge things. But Dr. Mercer reminded me, with all his professional restraint, that recovery is often measured in fractioned gains. We look for improvement in function, in social engagement, in reduction of hallucinations and paranoid ideation, he told me. He used the clinical language I had heard in court, but this time his words were delivered in the low voice of a man who sees patients beyond the headlines. We may see relapses. We may see setbacks. We must be prepared. There were setbacks. In the second month, David called me from the hospital one afternoon, and I could hear agitation under his words. "They implanted something," he said, and then he began to rattle off accusations that didn't add up into anything I could answer. He was frightened and convinced of things that were not present. The staff intervened, and after a short episode of increased medication and observation, things stabilized again. The staff's record would call it a flare. We called it a hard day. But there were also sunlight moments. Around month 4, during a supervised visit, David brought me a page he'd written. It was a letter of a kind, a note he had labored over somewhere between therapy sessions and medication adjustments. He wrote, in shaky but legible script, a paragraph apologizing for the space between us. He didn't name all the bad things. He didn't need to. He wrote about remembering the porch swing and wanting to return to a time when numbers and ledgers didn't define him. He wrote that he wanted help. I cried over that little sheet of paper in my car and then read it again before the nurse could call him into the next activity. That act, writing, was not a cure. It was a sign. He was, in some way, reachable. The community around us responded in disparate ways. Helen kept visiting, bringing small comforts and newspaper clippings about plants to keep my mind off the sessions in court. Jessica, the ex-wife, showed up once carrying a boxed set of old family photos and left them on my stoop with a note that asked me to give them to David when appropriate. Bruce Patterson, uneasy but generative in his own way, gave a statement to the court about the pressures at the office and then stopped by to tell me he'd set up a small fund to help in the immediate mortgage clamor that had threatened David in the months leading up to everything. None of this erased the trials, but it created a lattice of practical and emotional scaffolding that kept us moving. The hospital submitted periodic reports to the court. They documented medication regimens, group therapy attendance, participation in occupational therapy, and occasional setbacks. The reports were factual and devoid of melodrama. They spoke of symptom reduction and increased insight in measured phrases. At a 6-month review hearing, the judge read the hospital's report aloud. He noted that David had shown significant engagement in treatment and had at times demonstrated lucid periods and cooperative behavior. The judge ordered continued commitment but allowed for more flexible visitation privileges and for the hospital to file for possible conditional outpatient treatment when clinically appropriate. Those words, significant engagement, felt like a small grace. Not because they meant a return to some fairy tale normal, but because they recorded that the work of treatment had traction. The judge also emphasized the conditional nature of whatever came next. Progress must be sustained. Public safety and David's well-being both needed balancing. I wrestled, repeatedly, with guilt. I had lied on the phone. That lie had been a tool that kept me alive in a very immediate sense, and it had bought evidence that led to intervention. I thought about whether I had been too late, whether my slowness in calling the police earlier had been a moral failing. Amanda, practicing law and compassion together, quelled my self-flagellation with the kind of reasoning she uses in court. You gathered evidence. You used it to get help. That is not negligence. It is care under terrible circumstances. Her words were balm. They did not erase the things I couldn't unsee, but they gave me a framework to act. On the hospital grounds, there were rituals that became familiar. The routine check-ins, the group therapy sessions we would sit in on as family members, the educational meetings where clinicians explained what hallucinations can feel like and how they can be misinterpreted as malevolent counsel by those who hear them. At one of those family education sessions, Dr. Mercer said something simple in his unadorned way that lodged in me. Mental illness doesn't erase accountability, but it changes the way we respond to it. That phrase, changes the way we respond, moved from legal abstract into the small daily choices I had to make. Visit often, set boundaries, advocate for medication adjustments when he was suffering, and be an ally in his recovery without enabling dangerous behaviors. I learned about patience the hard way. Recovery is not cinematic. It is a repetition of small moments. In month 5, David and I walked in the hospital courtyard under a sky that was cleared after rain. He pointed to a bench and sat like someone flinching into new directions. He asked me about the house, about Helen's tomatoes, about the small swing he had loved. He asked too about the photographs he'd been taking of my things. The weirdness of that behavior still unsettled me, and in that exchange he showed a capacity for shame and for explanation that felt real. He told me, haltingly, I thought if he could make me do it, I would be forgiven. That phrase, perverse and pleading, was a window into a mind that had been trying to process action and compulsion as if they were the same thing. Dr. Mercer remained cautious. He spoke in the language of clinical caution. There is improvement in insight and a reduction in hallucinations on medication X. We are seeing consistent attendance and therapy. Yet we must remain observant for relapse triggers, and his long-term prognosis depends on adherence and continued social support. He refused to oversell anything. He refused to render the case into a narrative of redemption without caveats. That honesty kept my hopes measured and my efforts steady. By month 6, some things had shifted enough to permit a supervised visit at the house. The hospital filed a request, and the court approved a supervised, day-only visit to gauge how David handled familiar spaces. When he arrived, he walked slowly, touching the porch railing as if it had a memory he could feel through his fingers. We sat in the kitchen and drank tea. He smelled like the hospital in the way that institutional places carry a faint linen scent. We ate from the same plates we had used for years, and for a time, nothing dramatic happened. He laughed at something Helen said in the next room. He asked about a neighbor's dog. It was, in a sense, the ordinary miracle that a person could occupy the same house without catastrophe. He did not stay overnight. He returned with the staff and with a tired smile. That visit became a milestone report to the court. I cannot make promises about recovery. I will not, because Dr. Mercer would remind me he's right. There were no guarantees. I could, however, point to progress. Fewer angry outbursts, better sleep on medication, a willingness to talk in therapy. He volunteered in a booklet-making group at the hospital's occupational therapy unit, binding pages and learning a craft. That small productivity mattered. It meant his hands were busy in ways that were not destructive. It meant the therapies had something to anchor. In the months after commitment, community conversations changed tone. People who had once cast glances when I walked to the market nodded with a tentative kindness that recognized both the fragility and the effort of recovery. I began, finally, to let myself envision a picture that wasn't rigidly defined by fear. I still keep the camera footage on a hard drive in a locked drawer. I still have the certificate copies of the life insurance documents and the file on the vial. They are reminders and evidence that what happened was real and required response. But alongside them, I keep the letter he wrote, and the small photograph of him at 6, and the page of a journal where he wrote one line. I want to remember. People ask why I lied on the phone that night. They ask why I didn't shout no and call the police sooner. The honest answer is messy. I lied because the lie bought time. Time to collect facts, time for others to intervene, and time to keep myself from becoming immediate prey to panic. That lie protected me enough to set in motion the practical and legal steps that followed. But the truth behind that lie, why my son had been quietly assembling a plan, was never going to be solved by a lie alone. The facts we discovered, vial, device, forged documents, and life insurance, were only part of the story. The rest of it was in a mind that had become unmoored and needed help. If there is one narrative thread I want to be very clear about, it is this. Mental illness is not an explanation that absolves action and does not always coincide with criminality. In David's case, the law and medicine concluded that his mental state at the time required treatment under judicial oversight. That judgment does not remove consequence. It redirects it toward care. There are no easy answers here. There are only processes that try imperfectly to balance safety, responsibility, and humanity. 6 months on, the visits continue. They are part ritual and part homework. I bring the same photographs. He brings small crafts. Sometimes we sit in silence. Sometimes we talk about numbers and the way he used to like them, the way they used to feel like a puzzle he could solve. Once, in a quiet moment, he asked me if I forgave him. I took that question seriously. I told him that forgiveness is a long, uneven road. one that includes accountability and also work toward repair. I said I loved him and that my love did not erase harm. He cried quietly, and the sound felt like a small washing of the things that had been sealed tight. There are nights when the clock hits 9:15, and the old animal panic returns like a cue in a play. It is not as sharp as before. The police presence and the hands of the system have constructed a buffer. But the sound of that time can still make me look at my phone. Those instincts don't disappear with hearings and treatment plans. They live in the biology of a person who nearly lost something very dear. The judge has scheduled periodic reviews. The hospital continues to report progress to the court. We all move along the slow arc of law and medicine. I go to family therapy. Amanda checks in. Helen brings tomatoes in late summer and tells me with her practical humor that plants don't judge. They just grow when tended. That image has become oddly consoling. Tending rather than judging, one day at a time. If you're hearing this and you have a friend or a family member who calls at odd hours, or you see strange changes in behavior, small thefts, secrecy, withdrawals, please take them seriously. Early intervention can change the arc of a story. I don't say that as a prescription for all situations. I say it as someone who learned the cost of hesitating. If the story of my son and our lie has a moral, it is not that lies are good or bad in themselves. It is that choices made in fear sometimes become the only lever we have. Mine brought evidence. That evidence brought help. The truth behind the lie was that what we were dealing with was not merely malice or greed, it was a mind that needed medicine and care. I want to close with a small, stubborn piece of hope. The man who came into my kitchen on the footage and took photographs of our life was both the son I raised and a patient who needed care. Those identities do not erase each other. They complicate how you think about accountability and compel you to ask deeper questions about what it means to protect and to parent when the person you love becomes dangerous to themselves or others. We acted imperfectly with the limited tools we had. Cameras, calls, friends, police, attorneys, and a hospital willing to treat. We chose treatment over revenge. It is not an answer that removes pain, but it is a pathway that, so far, has kept a human life from being reduced to a headline. If this story has moved you, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Share if you know someone who needs to hear about mental health vigilance and the fragile choices families make. And if you or someone you love is dealing with similar signs, please reach out to professionals in your community. Treatment is a process. It is not a promise, but it is a place to begin. Thank you for listening.